All right, welcome to Chapter 9. This is the chapter on race and ethnicity. This is one of my very favorite chapters because not only do we have so much to learn, but there's so much always going on, and that has to do with race and race relations. I've been doing work in race relations, diversity consulting, you name it, for the last 25 years. And again, it continues to be of paramount importance to us, and we know that right now is a pivotal moment in history in regards to race in this culture, in this country as well. So anyway, let's jump in. A lot of these are going to be questions, and then we'll talk about that once we get to this point in the semester. But is our choice to cast a vote for a particular candidate a purely personal decision? As we look at the percentage who voted for Barack Obama in 2012, men and women who are non-Hispanic whites, Hispanic Americans, and African Americans. Certainly, when we have had a lack for decades and decades and decades and longer of diverse candidates, it was a really, really important election, and race was a central focus, even though not really through Barack or his campaign particularly, but because of Barack being the first African-American presidential candidate. So that brings us into sort of like a territory where all of a sudden we saw more racism, we saw more conversations about race, and really than we had in decades. So let's take a look at some questions, knowing that we're not in a post-racial society, that race does matter, that people a long time ago decided exactly for who and how much it mattered, and how those carry forward in inequalities and what we're going to do about it today. That's a lot for this chapter, but I'm excited about it. So, does race matter to you? On top is Cornell, Dr. Brother Cornell West, and the bottom is Howard Zinn. If you haven't read A People's History of the United States, that's a fantastic history text that really shows things not through just dominant culture eyes, but a really comprehensive look at history. So does race matter to you? All right, and the next question, how much does race matter to you? A ton, some, which I guess is also like not very much, or D, not at all. And again, we'll look at these. All right, so describe what comes to mind when you hear the word race in just a few words. And of course, Dr. King here. This is just to get us thinking about, I mean, through what lens are we seeing race? How does that change throughout time? And how do we look at sociologically so that we can apply different perspectives and understand what's going on, all with the intention, and of course, why we do a lot of sociology, to make things more equal, to make things fair, to really fulfill the promises of the culture and society that we live in. From last year, CSU students in the middle failing tremendously. And then some old school waiting room for colors only, some older pictures on the left, then Black Lives Matter protests. And then after that, then there was, of course, the Blue Lives Matter protest, sort of woke as a racist response to the Black Lives Matter protest, although there are, issues for policing as well, and they are very much intertwined. Now, I mentioned earlier in the semester, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences, meaning most of what we'll find out about race that is stereotyping and discrimination and racism and what people used to call science is built entirely on a foundation of falsehoods and lies and historical sociological momentum. So again, it continues to move forward. Our situation or our challenge looking at this now is how can we help, right? Because throughout this entire chapter, and when we're talking about race, I need you all to remember one thing, and that's everybody I would talk to out there or who would watch this video, and that is a lot of times we think about it as guilt, right? Well, what do we have to do? And I'm not doing enough, but we can never frame it in terms of guilt. Guilt is what you feel when you know something's maybe been done wrong or doing wrong, and that's not an active phase. We don't want to be there ever. What we really want to do is be in a situation where we're about responsibility. Okay, so when we talk about reparations, when we talk about statistical inequalities, massive gaps in healthcare and different things that matter, particularly to people of color they are living that life, even though to many of us in dominant culture, race isn't even a thing, we have to understand that we want to look at that in a way that is compassionate and that is also filled with responsibility, because that's what we take when we know that something's up. And of course, in regards to race, we've always known something is up. It's just how quiet or how loud the voices are that are telling us to not pay attention to it, or that are saying, look, we need to do something about our children being hunted by police, or whatever that might be, pay or healthcare inequalities, which is a big one, of course. So anyway, some ideas here. And of course, a lot of work to do on campus in regards to race. We consistently see over the last several years people making the worst decisions, students, and then having very little consequences for it. And that's been building and building and building. And people are no longer willing to settle for that. Administration shouldn't be as well. And so I'm excited to see where we go with that as a college campus and community. And I know that my students are not the ones that are engaging in this, because you're learning a lot about the reality of race and inequality all semester long. So thanks for being good people, sort of, as we jump into this. All right, race and ethnicity. So we ask some questions here like we do every chapter, and that would be, what are race and ethnicity? How are they created by society? I mean, what are they, right? Are they real things? Are they not? Do they have real life consequences? What are those? Why does race in the United States have so much, or why does the United States have so much racial and ethnic diversity? How are race and ethnicity important dimensions of social inequality today, and who are disadvantaged in society and who are dominant? And just because you might be in a dominant group, people of European descent, look, I know most of all, my parents, both teachers, both people of European descent, so am I, and yet struggle in all sorts of ways. That doesn't mean that you have it all. That just means that according to the ways that we define it and are going to look at it, we know that you may be in a dominant group rather than a disadvantaged or minority group. So what's that mean for us? What are our realities like? These are the big questions that we ask in sociology. All right, so which has a more positive connotation or feeling to it? The word race or ethnicity? Race, ethnicity, they're both equally positive or they're both equally negative in your view. Now, this is one we don't even have to go back and look at. Semester, year after year, ethnicity has a more positive connotation to it. Students, hear racism in race and think that that's been such a heated way to look and think about it. But we're going to talk about how this chapter, that race and ethnicity are quite different. And I think you're on the right track if you're thinking that one has a more positive and more representative meaning to it, for sure. So what is race? I'm a Star Wars fan. Oh, that's not bad. Anyway, is it Wookiees? Is it like Yoda things? Is it people? Han Solo? That's my man. I like the picture in the middle of Chewbacca. It reminds me of my Boston Terrier for some reason. Is it aliens? Right? Because you would think that on this planet, it's pretty obvious that we're one human race, right? And then if we were to expand past that, but we only know this, maybe then we can get into Wookiees and you name it. So race, really, when we look at sociology, is in ethnicity, they're huge categories, right? And they've been defined and redefined. But race is a foundation of identity and a basis for social inequality. Bam. Flat out the gate, know what to expect. Think, important for testing and important for understanding that, right? People use it to identify, and people use it as a basis for social inequality. I mean, people want to say race doesn't matter. I understand that that's something you want to say, but clearly it does. So that's why while we're looking at how it matters, because that's the important part, right? And then how we can change that. So race, a constructed or socially constructed, which is really important, category of people who share biologically transmitted traits, right, that members of a society consider important. There's a lot going on there. Socially constructed and members of a society consider it's important. Certainly there's some biological transmitted traits, and people are recognizable and stacked or distinct, in fact, by that. So socially defined group of people, generally considered to be distinct, and generally by themselves and others to be considered a distinct group. Could be skin color, hair texture, facial features, and of course, a lot of that, as we'll learn, is dependent just really upon where groups of people once, right, because we're all from Africa, all right, Pangea, but once we move from there to the rest of the world as we know it, then how did that manifest and what did that look like? Because clearly that changes, when you have access to all sorts of things, vitamin D and things like that. We'll look at that. But the concept of race has two components, right? There's a social component and a physical component. Again, good to know for the test, but also important to know as we kind of hone in on what is race, right? So social group identity, a group must be recognized in some way by its own members or others as a distinct group and having some characteristics in common. We know that, right? So without social recognition, it wouldn't be identified as race. And then a physical piece. Every race is generally regarded as being somehow different in appearance from other races, right? But we have to understand that really the concept of race is built upon a social component, and it is a social choice to define what differences matter, color of skin, eye color, whatever that might be, and how much they matter. And we have to understand that largely throughout history, it hasn't been people who don't have a lot of power and access who have defined that. It has been people who are more powerful, who are in charge in any given society, who determine that. So we don't look at brown folks always and say, hey, how come race matters so much to you? How come you make it such a big deal? In fact, the answer is because usually people in the dominant position have worked tirelessly through generation after generation to make it so, right? So we have to understand that the responsibility, like I talked about before, lies with all of us, and we just don't lump that on the folks that are consistently in the minority categories of people who we look to as if it is their problem to solve, and we live in a vacuum and don't know why these inequalities exist. We do. They're purposeful, institutionalized, and statistically, getting more and more and more unequal. And in some ways, throughout history, we've gotten better and better and better in ways. Again, we look at that from many perspectives. So why do people display racial characteristics? Racial characteristics appeared amongst human ancestors as a result of living in different parts of the world, right? I mean, variety of racial traits is the product of migration. You just didn't stay in one place. We didn't as human beings. So we know that it comes down to a very, very small 0.0, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head percentage of what it is, of how we're actually different. But that is because of melanin and how much melanin we have based on ultraviolet lights and where we have lived or settled in the world, right? So melanin is that element in our skin that protects us from all ultraviolet rays associated with various types of skin cancers. So populations living near the equator have darker skin to protect them from the harsh impacts of the sun. We've known this for quite some time, right? And it certainly changes throughout the year in non-equatorial populations. I mean, availability of food containing vitamin D is huge, but also, and sort of as we back up, the impact of the sun. I mean, living in Colorado even is much different than living in Illinois, which would be much different than living in the Arctic or Sweden, right? Viking territory, or conversely, right up on the equator itself. Okay, so availability of food containing vitamin D and calcium, regional cloud cover, like I said, amount of clothing worn in certain areas. Is there some Inuit folks here? And obviously they're going to be wearing a lot of clothes to protect themselves from the cold all the time, whereas equatorial populations would not be. So melanin, a really simple and very tiny thing that has really caused for concern socially, historically, in these contexts. I mean, we have a lot of people that think as race is biological or genetic, but we have a total inability to agree on how many races there are. Scientists three, as many as 34 or more. Classifications, especially racial classifications, change from time to time. They change from place to place, culture to culture, and they are always variable. And once you look at long-term interbreeding between different groups and populations of people, we can call them races because we've made that distinct, but it makes that idea of a pure race in a biological sense meaningless. I mean, people that try and purport the idea of a pure white or Aryan race or whatever that might be, it doesn't bear any resemblance to reality or science, and we know that oftentimes those groups bear no resemblance to reality or science. So from a biological point of view, knowing about a person's race or racial category allows us to predict nothing about them. Of course, socially, right, we've constructed that because we know that race, and particularly amongst sociologists, and this is an important concept, race is more socially constructed than it is a biological or genetic piece, okay? All right, and lastly, at least for this episode, sociologists see race as fluid and historically changing, something that was invented by Europeans in the 18th century, so it was constructed by folks, and for a long time that wasn't the case, and there was no need for it amongst human populations. Furthermore, once that was invented by Europeans, we've come to see race as a fixed and universal piece, right? Once we learn to sort of see a number of races, then we only see it that way, right? If all we have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, we know that. So we use these categories as a basis of how we perceive, and this is huge. Race is used to how we see people, how we reward them, how we punish them, and as a total justification for discrimination. But we're going to continue to break it on down because I think that is really important, and I love this chapter, like I said. So we're going to come back to it again. So cue that music and be good people and do good things. Thanks, everybody.